Ehud Olmert's tenure as prime minister, there was yet another offer to the Palestinians to share sovereignty of Jerusalem. This has been fairly consistent with Israeli governments, that when it comes down to it, when the Palestinians are ready, this is what this is going to look like. I guess what I'm saying is that if you don't have the expansion, the creation of new settlements in the area, and all you do is mainly settlement activity in Ma'ale Adumim, then what is... And also, by the way, you're ignoring the fact that everybody has agreed that Netanyahu has removed a lot of roadblocks in the West Bank. He was just joined into the OECD, and that he's focused what he calls an economic peace plan. So it's not like Netanyahu has done absolutely nothing. He's approached it in his own way, and then after pressure, you're right, there was pressure from Obama, embrace a two-state solution and do this temporary freeze, which, by the way, you don't like that freeze, but George Mitchell, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama all seem to think that is a significant step, and they've described it as at least the most far-reaching concession on settlements from any prime minister. You want to debate about that, that's fine, but your debate is with, the people in the middle of the peace process right now for the U.S. side.
Oh, okay, Eli. One of the things that makes this a little bit difficult is you keep moving around to so many different topics. That it's a little bit difficult for me to respond to them all. Let me start with this point about the settlement freeze. You're right. I don't agree with what the Obama administration publicly said about Obama. I'm much more interested in taking actually the views of the Israelis who actually track settlement growth. And in fact, I think also more credible is Netanyahu's own transportation minister, who said basically construction is going on at the same peak it was before. When you're right, it's good that they've taken down some roadblocks in the West Bank. I think that is great, but I don't think you'll ever read a single story about the economic growth that's taken place in certain parts of the West Bank without Palestinians complaining bitterly about how hard the settlements still make economic life in the West Bank, and the fact that Netanyahu is actually now trying to legalize certain illegal outposts. They're not removing illegal outposts at all. In fact, they're going out of their way to try to legalize some of them, I think, is particularly pernicious. On the Olmert question, I give Olmert all the credit in the world for finally coming around to the position that, in fact, there should be a Palestinian state and that it should include, in fact, East Jerusalem, which is the position that Netanyahu himself ruled out at that Bar-Ilan speech when he said there would be no Palestine, when he said all of Jerusalem would have to remain under Israeli sovereignty. But I think it's also important to look at the conditions under which Olmert made that proposal. I mean, it's funny you said the Taba wasn't a real proposal, because what Olmert made was not in that sense a real proposal either. It was never written down. It was never consulted with his cabinet. It was a verbal offer by a guy who was already a lame duck, who had already basically said he was going to step down. So while I really applaud Ehud Olmert for finally coming to the view that there should be a Palestinian state with some sovereignty over East Jerusalem, I think it would have been crazy to imagine that in fact at that stage in his prime ministership you really would have been able to get a deal done.
All right, well, let's move on to something, because in subsequent pieces and back and forth on this stuff, you have embraced, I guess, the view that the U.S. should talk to Hamas. Is that right? Or the U.S. should encourage a unity government? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Describe your position.
I think at least I would say that I think the U.S. Should have been supportive of a Palestinian unity government, and that we could have taken the same position we do with the Hezbollah ministers in the Lebanese government, which is we deal with the Lebanese non-Hezbollah ministers, and we don't deal with the Hezbollah ones. Yeah.
And is that still your position?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you've also written that you think that Salam Fayyad, and you get no argument from me, Salam Fayyad seems like a true reformer, and Abu Mazen represent like the best Palestinian leaders to date to cut a deal. But don't you think that in advocating a policy that would support their rivals, who only 2 years ago were throwing Fatah security guys off of buildings, albeit probably provoked and such, but is undermining the best chance for a peace leader from the Palestinians in your view?
No, I mean, not necessarily. I think that the Palestinian unity government would very likely, I mean, if you look at the Mecca agreement, would have kept Abbas as prime minister to allow that negotiating process to take place. Maybe it would have limited Abbas and Fayyad in certain ways, but it also would have meant that you had a unified Palestinian national movement, which I think is really the key to ultimately being able to get a deal. I think it is really very, very hard to imagine that you can basically have war with Gaza and really significant movement with the West Bank. So I think ultimately it was very important to have a unified Palestinian national movement. I mean, it's important that I think that you acknowledge that what happened in Gaza, the fighting between Hamas and Fatah was really provoked. I think that the U.S., in particular, the Bush administration, really deserves a lot of blame for basically not only opposing bringing the two parties together, which I think is really what Hamas wanted, at least for tactical reasons, and in fact encouraging Fatah to try to take power violently in Gaza, which led to them getting their asses kicked, to put it colloquially. I think that there were a whole series of blunders made, and I take that from the position of looking at the Gaza war. I mean, I recognize that in any kind of war, horrible things are going to take place. But I think that's why it's particularly important to ask the question of whether this was a last resort and whether people exhausted political opportunities to try to prevent this showdown from taking place. And I think these were some of the political opportunities that could have been seized after Hamas won an election that, let's remember, the Bush administration, in fact, demanded that the Palestinians hold as part of their democracy push in the Middle East.
Wow, Peter, I mean, as a guy who cares about human rights and liberalism, don't you see the risk of having the West effectively, indirectly, albeit, but effectively recognizing that Hamas, it's okay for an organization like Hamas that, encourages children to become suicide bombers and, the whole rest who really are interested in kind of creating a Sharia state. It strikes me that it's making a very similar mistake to what was done by empowering Arafat in a way during the peace process, a guy who used his power dictatorially against Palestinians. And in many ways, if you want to get back to sort of the provocation, it goes back a long way. But the human rights violations under Oslo, because, there was a support for Arafat, and you want to do the same thing to Hamas, which is getting a lot of its money from Iran and represents an ideology which is not just the elimination of the Jewish state, but I think the elimination and the end of the day of Palestine. It just strikes me as, it just strikes me as extremely cruel policy that puts you in the camp of Daniel Levy and the New America Foundation, Steve Clemens, and all these folks who just sort of are rushing to kind of recognize Hamas, where I think that there is a real danger there. It doesn't recognize Palestinian politics themselves are in play, and the card of recognition, especially from the United States and the West, is a very valuable card. And I don't know. I mean, it strikes me as a kind of, at the end of the day, a real morally vacuous policy.
Well, look,
and a problematic one. Yeah.
I mean, I detest Hamas. I detest.
I know you do. I know, and you've made that. Yeah.
I want to be clear about that. But I actually think, and I think the question of the degree to which the U.S. recognized Hamas, I think could have been to some degree handled by this way we deal with Hezbollah in Lebanon. But I actually, look, when you're dealing with an organization like Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or whoever, there's always a risk. But the fundamental difference, I think, between the policy, of course, the whole irony of this is this was partly the Bush administration, which was basically taking the view, I think ultimately really the right view, that basically you're better off trying to have a political process in which you have free elections and you bring a movement, even an odious movement like Hamas, into a government. I think you would have had to have Hamas change to some degree, like being part of a government that endorsed the Arab League 2002 plan, for instance, which would have been a kind of a backhanded way of accepting Israel's existence. And I think you would have obviously had to have some kind of willingness to have a ceasefire and to not take violent action, which Hamas, in fact, even on its own, did at various points between its election and the late 2008 Gaza war. But I think that would have been a much better solution than the one we've had today. I mean, how morally is it profiting the Palestinians today to be ruled entirely by Hamas in Gaza without any national unity government that could provide some trace of liberalism, and then in a embargo situation where 80% of the population is on food aid? It seems to me what we have now is a real moral nightmare, and I don't think this was the best possible scenario to play itself out.
Well, listen, if you want to argue that the Israelis and the Egyptians in their enforcement of embargoes in the border should allow in pasta and macaroni, you don't get an argument from me. However, I would really point out here that it's pretty. Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad, the good guys, have really urged, don't deal with Hamas. They're not interested in peace. They're not interested in coexistence with either us or Israel. And they've said this loud and clear privately and publicly. And it's very telling. I mean, listen, you want to go, we can talk about Gaza at the end of this, but, during the Gaza offensive at the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, you will search for a quote from Mahmoud Abbas and you won't find one condemning it. So it seems to me that it's like you're almost prejudging like an important question in Palestinian politics. Then finally, I would say there is a difference between Ikhwan or Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or even the Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq, which are parties committed to a political process because they don't arm themselves. And then Hamas, and Hezbollah for that matter, which are committed to both the political process when it works for them, but also the terrorism process when it doesn't work for them, and the armed struggle process when it doesn't work for them. And you run into a lot of problems. I think I agree with you about you have to a degree, accept that there's going to be parties that embrace an Islamic politics or political Islam in future democracies in the Middle East. But you really have to be very clear that you don't want to accept parties that are also dangerous militias that bully their political opposition. And evidence of their bullying, Peter, as you know and I do, is that Hamas has been delaying. They don't want another election, probably because they would lose. So what I don't understand is why you, and not so much you, because you're not been out in front of this, but why the New America Foundation and George Soros and others, who push this line aren't doing the opposite. Why aren't they saying, I want a free and fair election for the Palestinians, and I want to try to support whoever's running against Hamas?
But Eli, I mean, it's hard to say you support a free and fair election for the Palestinians if you basically say that you're then going to not recognize the result of those elections when Hamas wins. I mean, the Bush administration's kind of whole democracy push in a way was so badly undermined by the blatant hypocrisy of that. I agree with you absolutely that the goal has got to be for Hamas to be a political party, maybe a political party with views that I very much dislike, but a political party and not a militia. It's difficult to do that in a context when you don't even have a Palestinian state, but I think the best analogy would be something like what happened with the IRA. It was a long process, basically, of gradually trying to wean the IRA, also a very nasty bunch of guys, more and more away from military action and more away towards political action by trying to invest them in the political process and make it harder and harder for them to basically to defect from it. I think so. You can agree that ultimately the goal absolutely has to be, one gun one kind of sovereignty in the Palestinian territories, which has control of force of arms, but believe that in fact that it was unrealistic to expect that you were going to get there with Hamas right away, and that in fact you needed a process to get there. In fact, I think what we've done instead is really not force Hamas to actually have to try to be held accountable by being in various cabinet ministries in a larger government headed by Abbas, which itself would be committed to a ceasefire and at least in a certain kind of way accept Israel's right to exist, and then see how they perform. I think that would have been a much better result than the result we've seen, which has been so tragic for both Gazans and Israelis in the last few years. You're right that there's some people in Fatah who were very happy for basically us to try to crush Hamas, but I think we saw the folly of that position when we basically reportedly, kind of encouraged Ahlan to try to take power in Gaza, and it backfired.
Well, I'm not going to, get into the relationship with Ahlan, but just to go back to your IRA analogy, Peter, I think that it's more like when the IRA split with the real IRA, and there were still these, irredentists in the Irish